Hello and welcome to Lifespan Development Psychology. My name is Matthew Poole and I'm an instructor of psychology at Northeast State Community College. In this chapter, we are going to be setting the foundation for what this class will entail, as well as let you know what the foundation of developmental psychology really is. Now, firstly, we're going to introduce human development to you by introducing the three domains, which includes how you develop physically, psychosocially, as well as cognitively from birth to death. So when I'm referring to these physical domain, this can include things like your height, your weight, your fine and gross motor skills, your brain development, puberty, sexual health, fertility and menopause, changes in your senses, as well as primary and secondary aging. Now, when I refer to the cognitive domain, this can include topics such as language development. This includes thinking, logical thinking, abstract reasoning, learning and understanding, memory abilities, moral reasoning, practical intelligence, as well as wisdom. Now, the third domain is known as psychosocial. So these topics can include things like psychological and social development, temperament and attachment, emotions, personality, self-esteem, relationships, identity development, dating, romance, cohabitation, marriage, and having children, as well as finding work or career, and caregiving, retirement, coping with losses, and death and dying. Okay. Now, whenever we're referring to, throughout the class, theorists of lifespan development psychology, they can fall under a couple different categories: continuous versus discontinuous development. A lot of theorists throughout history in developmental psychology, at least more prominent ones that we'll refer to in this class, think of your development as more so happening on a discontinuous level. So whenever I say something is a continuous development process, this means it's more so like a cumulative process, like an escalator of improvement over time, gradually improving on existing skills. And although I do think that there are a number of skills or forms of development that are continuous, like improving on a skill over time, again, most of the theories that we'll go through and the theorists, they think of how you develop as more so discontinuous, aka happening in unique stages. So once you get through stage 1, then you can move to stage 2, so on and so forth. Okay. Now, an issue that has been discussed within developmental psychology includes the topic of, is there one course of development or are there many courses? And what I mean by that, one course includes things like development is essentially the same for all, development is universal, as well as stage theories. So there are certain forms of development that will span across the entire world. There are physiological developments that you can't help no matter what. This includes things like the onset of puberty, things like that. Now, many courses of development have been very popular in the sense that, depending on where you grow up in the world, that can really influence, your environment, how you develop due to like that environment, culture, specific genetics. Basically saying that, development follows a different course for each child. Now, another topic that's been discussed in developmental psychology is nature versus nurture. Now, we're going to settle this debate right off the bat, and if you've watched my Introduction to Psychology lecture series, we dive into this quite a bit. So whenever you're referring to somebody's nature, this is strictly talking about somebody's biology and their genetics, what they are given at birth by their biological parents. Now, your nurture is the environment in which you grow up in, as well as your culture, where you grow up in the world. And this can include things like your parents, as well as your peers, your teachers, etc. And although back in the day it was nature versus nurture, which explains how you behave better, it should be viewed as an interactionist model, nature and nurture, because both are involved. Both your genes as well as your environment are involved in shaping who you become and how you behave. All right, so let's talk about some basic periods of human development. Let's first introduce the different stages that we'll go throughout the class. So we'll talk about prenatal development, So this includes like your fetal periods, infancy and toddlerhood, the first couple years of life, early childhood, ages 2 to 5 or 6, middle childhood, ages 6 to 11, adolescence from 12 to 18, early adulthood, late teens, 20s, and 30s. Then we'll move toward talking about middle adulthood, your late 30s or age 40 through about your mid 60s. And then we'll dive into talking about late adulthood and death and dying. And we'll distinguish the difference down the road in late adulthood, the difference between young old versus oldest old. Have I lost you yet? Okay. So whenever we're talking about the lifespan perspective, I want to go ahead and talk about right out the gate that development occurs across one's entire life or is lifelong. This is commonly associated with Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, where comparatively to Freud thinks that your development is kind of set in stone by the time you reach adolescence. His discontinuous theory only reaches up until adolescence, whereas Erikson, his crosses the entire lifespan in unique stages. So development encompasses the entire lifespan from conception to death. Now, the traditional view is focused on conception to adolescence and the gradual decline in old age. And it was believed that the 5 or 6 decades after adolescence yielded little to no developmental change at all, aka Freud's perspective. Now, the current view is that changes in development can occur later in life without having been established at birth. So you can still develop well into your adulthood. As well, development is multidimensional. So we've already established the 3 domains that we will discuss throughout the class. We have the physiological changes. Your physical changes include your hormone levels, primary and secondary sex characteristics, changes in height and weight. And then you've got the cognitive changes, okay? So cognition, remember, equals thinking. So it changes in terms of the ability to think abstractly. And then you've got emotional and social changes, which are involved in regulating emotions, interacting with peers, and possibly dating, aka psychosocial development. So development is multi-dimensional as well as multi-directional. Okay, and results in gains and losses throughout life. So we have the capacity for both an increase and decrease in the efficacy of certain traits over the course of the lifespan. So we have this selective optimization with compensation, which is prioritizing and improving the efficacy of particular functions, thereby reducing the adaptive capacity of other functions. So, for example, in childhood, we have difficulty with regulating emotions and impulsive actions. And then in adolescence, we have this increased ability to regulate emotions and impulses, but they may sacrifice spontaneity, creativity, or fast responding. Okay, and development is plastic, and I don't mean the type of plastic that you drink through a straw. Okay, this is talking about that the characteristics that you experience are malleable or changeable. So when I'm referring to something being plastic, I'm referring to it being malleable or changeable. So the nature of human development is more pluralistic than originally thought. There's no single pathway in development. So I want you to consider the example of cognitive decline and aging. So dimensions of cognitive decline are partially reversible because the brain retains the lifelong capacity for plasticity and reorganization of cortical tissue. And research suggests that cognitive functions such as memory can be improved in mature adults with age-related cognitive decline by using brain plasticity-based training methods. As well, development is contextual. So development is influenced by these contextual and sociocultural influences. So this includes development varies from person to person, obviously. So it depends on the context of the situation, depending on factors such as the person's biology, family, school, church, your profession, nationality, as well as ethnicity. And there are 3 types of contextual influences that operate across the lifespan. This includes normative age-graded influences, normative history-graded influences, and non-normative influences. So whenever I'm referring to normative age-graded influences, this is biological and environmental factors that have a strong correlation with chronological age, as I mentioned earlier, things such as puberty or menopause. That is based on normative age grade, okay? And then age-based social practices such as beginning school or entering retirement happen around the same time, okay? Now, when we're referring to normative history graded influences, this is associated with a specific time period that defines the broader environmental and cultural context in which an individual develops. So, development and identity are influenced by historical events that people experience. For example, this includes the Great Depression, World War II, the Vietnam War, the Cold War, and the War on Terror, as well as advances in technology, because we know those history-based events have an influence on how we develop. Now, non-normative influences are things that are unpredictable and not tied to a certain time in a person's development or to a historical period. Okay, so the unique experiences of an individual, whether biological or environmental, shape the developmental process. So some examples of non-normative influences include earning a master's degree. Not everybody goes directly after their bachelor's degree to get a master's degree. Some don't get a master's degree at all. Getting a certain job offer, that can vary from person to person. We're not all on the same timeline when it comes to career growth. Going through a divorce, some people will do so, maybe early on in life, later in life, or maybe not at all, as well as coping with the death of a child. These are all examples of non-normative influences. Okay, let's look at some other contextual influences regarding socioeconomic status. So I'm going to refer to this a good bit throughout the class, but when you're referring to somebody's socioeconomic status, aka their social class, this is a way to identify families and households based on a few areas. This includes education, income, as well as occupation. So members of a social class tend to share similar lifestyles, patterns of consumption, parenting styles, stressors, religious preferences, and other aspects of daily life, although there are individual variations. Okay, so another contextual influence includes your culture. So often referred to as a blueprint shared by a group of people that specifies how to live. So what I mean by this is culture includes the ideas about the following: what is right versus wrong, what to strive for, what to eat, how to speak, what is valued, what kinds of emotions are called for in certain situations. Culture is learned from parents, schools, churches, media, friends, and others throughout a lifetime. So how do we know what we know, though? So we have what's known as experiential reality and agreement reality. So experiential reality is knowing based on your own history. How can you apply those schemas that you've developed from the past to influence you? Agreement reality, knowing based on what others have told you or cultural ideas. Okay, because we know we develop not just by things directly happening to us, but by hearing things from other people on what to pursue, on what to engage in. Now, problems with personal inquiry or drawing conclusions based on our own experience includes the tendency to see what we believe because of cognitive blinders. We're going to talk about throughout the class some biases, some cognitive biases that influence how you behave and how you develop in general. Now, I think a bias that we can all relate to is the confirmation bias. We've probably adhered to this bias at least once in our life where, our beliefs are important to us. This is why we don't always falter or flip back and forth whenever somebody comes at us with different opinions. We usually come to these beliefs based on a lot of thought effort. And so we don't just easily vary from belief to belief because of this. And so as a result, because of our beliefs and them being important to us, we may engage in this confirmation bias, which is our tendency to look for evidence that we are right, and in doing so, we ignore contradictory evidence. Okay, whenever we are referring to psychology as a whole. Psychology is a science. We apply the scientific method to our understanding of human behavior and the mind. And so the same is done in lifespan development psychology, where we're applying the scientific method to our understanding of how we develop psychosocially, physically, as well as cognitively from birth to death. So there is such an importance with the scientific method because it allows us to come to logical conclusions about our world, specifically related to lifespan development. So science involves continuously renewing our understanding of topics in question and ongoing investigation of how and why events occur. Science is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. We are constantly improving on it throughout our history. Now, any scientist that's worth their salt is, if they comes to you and they say they 100% have the correct idea, please run away from them as fast as possible, because any scientist who is legitimate is always going to leave room to be falsified or proven incorrect. So science is falsifiable, able to be proven incorrect. So scientific inquiry involves attempts to reject or refute a theory or set of assumptions. Okay, and this is important, this last bullet point here. A theory that cannot be falsified is not scientific. That also goes along with a hypothesis. We all grow up knowing that a hypothesis is an educated guess, but I would like to refer to it as a testable prediction, because a hypothesis and a theory can only be legitimate if it is able to be falsified or proven not supported. Okay. Now, whenever you're conducting a study, we have to put things into place to make it less biased. Because if we're left to our own devices and we're not cognizant of all the pieces going into our experiment, we can potentially influence the results to reflect what it is that we want to happen. So what we put into place, one of the things that we put into place is what's known as random sampling. So whenever you have a particular population that you're wanting to study, it's basically impossible to study every single person from that population. So you get what's known as a sample, and that sample has to be a significant number of individuals from that population, and it has to be random, meaning that every single person from that population has an equal chance of being selected for participation. All right? Otherwise, we can pick and choose who we want, and we may unknowingly or knowingly choose people that's going to fulfill the results that we want. Now, in science, you have two overall categories that you can conduct research through, which is quantitative versus qualitative. So when you're using quantitative research, as just a rule of thumb, you're referring to just numbers, okay? You're using statistical data. So you're quantifying or using statistics to understand phenomenon, to try and understand a cause and effect relationship. So you determine a research question, conduct a literature review of previous studies on the topic. You determine method of gathering information, conduct the study, interpret the results, and then draw conclusions. And with the scientific method through quantitative research, we don't just want to stop at finding these conclusions. We need to share our findings with the world so we can improve science as a whole. So we will usually submit this to peer review so other scientists can sign off on our work and consider it science. Then you've got qualitative research, which as a rule of thumb, it refers to people's lived experiences. It's less about the numbers, and the theoretical ideas are grounded in experiences. It begins with a broad area of interest. You gain interest into a group to be researched. You gather field notes about the setting, the people, the structure, the activities, or other areas of interest. You ask open-ended questions when interviewing participants. You modify research questions as the study continues, and you note patterns or consistencies. You explore new areas deemed important by the people being observed, and then again, the same with quantitative research, you report those findings. Now, when it comes to research methods and objectives, we have a few different forms of studies that we can conduct. We have these descriptive studies which are objective to describe phenomena. So you've got these main types such as observational research, case studies, where you're looking at one person or maybe a very small group of individuals. You can do surveys, which you can do electronically or in person, and content analysis. Now, with correlational research, you're trying to show that there's a relationship between variables. Now, just because though something is correlating does not equate to causation, but you can see whether or not there was a relationship there in the sense of when one variable goes up, does the other one go up as well? Or when one variable goes up and the other variable goes down, that is also a relationship, such noted as a negative correlation. Okay, you've got experimental research, which is randomly assigning people to different conditions. Use hypothesis testing to make inferences about how these conditions affect behavior. And then you've got explanatory studies, which are designed to answer the question why, as well as evaluation research, designed to assess the effectiveness of policies or programs. Now, one of the best studies that you can conduct, if you can pull it off, is an observational studies through a naturalistic observation. Because whenever you're observing people in their natural habitat and they don't feel like they're being studied or watched, it will allow them to act more in tune with how they, always are behaving. Now, the strength with this is that the researcher can see how people behave rather than rely on self-report. So one of the difficulties, though, is actually making it a true naturalistic observation where they don't feel like they're being observed. Yes, you can observe people in their natural habitat, but if they feel like they're being watched, the Hawthorne effect may come into place, where people tend to change their behavior, usually in tune with what they think the researcher is wanting to study or wanting to get the results of, or maybe they want to go against what the researcher is studying when they know that they are being observed. Okay, as I mentioned, case studies, these are really good at giving us a lot of information about a particular individual or small group of individuals. The difficulty, though, with case studies is that we can't generalize this information across a population. We can't say what happened to this person would definitely happen to the larger population as a whole. Now, surveys are really good because they're very convenient, I will say, in the sense that you can send this out to a vast majority of people and get a lot of participation. The difficulty, though, with surveys is they don't really allow for in-depth understanding of human behavior. And as we've noted in Introduction to Psychology, whenever you're self-reporting, there's going to automatically be some bias there because we as humans are not perfect, and trying to be introspective is not as reliable of a method in the sense of accuracy, okay? And it's important to note that just because something is valid does not inherently mean that it is reliable. And what I mean by that is just because something is reliable, just because you get 2 + 2 = 5, does not mean that it is valid, aka accurate. Okay. Now with content analysis, this involves reviewing media, such as old text, pictures, commercials, lyrics, to explore patterns or themes in culture. Some may also consider this archival research or secondary content analysis as well. So with archival research, this includes analyzing information that has already been collected or examined. So, the strength to this is that you don't have to recruit participants, but you also didn't get to conduct the study, and you're limited to just what the other researchers have the results of. And the quality of the data originally collected may be compromised as well. Okay, so with correlational research, I know I touched on it very briefly, but I want to reinforce it once again. So when I'm referring to correlational research, there are a few terms that we need to look at. Whenever I'm referring to a scatter plot, you're looking at one to the very right. So it's a plot of the relationship between two scores. Each dot represents a data point. Now, when there's a positive correlation, the variables go up or down together, so they move in the same direction. So when one goes up, the other one goes up as well. When one variable goes down, the other goes down. Okay, and then with negative correlation, this is whenever the variables move in opposite directions. So when one variable goes up, the other goes down, and vice versa. But just because there is a correlation, this does not equal causation. Okay, so a good example for this, there's a positive correlation between ice cream sales and drowning deaths. Okay, but does that mean that ice cream sales is causal of drowning deaths? No, it's likely that there's a third-party variable or a confounding variable. In that, it's the summer months. More people are more likely to buy ice cream in the summer months as well as engage in water-related activities. Okay. Now, experiments are designed to test hypotheses. And again, hypothesis is, yes, an educated guess, but I like to refer to as a testable prediction. You're actually able to come to a conclusion on this. And so a variable is anything that changes in value. And variables are operationalized, which means the researcher specifies exactly what is going to be measured. So this is the major advantage to this is the experimental method is the only research method that can measure cause and effect relationship between variables, but the major disadvantage is the difficulty translating much of what concerns us about human behavior into a laboratory setting. Okay, so a basic experimental design begins with a sample. Okay, as I've already mentioned, a subset of a population. And then once you have that random sample, you are randomly assigning. So like I said, everybody from that population has an equal chance of being selected for participation. But as well, when you have that random sample, you have the random assignment where each individual has an equal chance of being either in the experimental or the control group. Now, the experimental group is the group that is going to receive the manipulated variable. So if you're conducting a study on, you've created the strongest sleeping pill ever, and you want to see how that inhibits people's cognitive performance on a test, then you give them that. And then you have the control group, which is quite simply the group that we are just comparing the experimental group to. They will not receive the manipulated variable. Okay, and so what I mean by that is you would give them like a sugar pill, which has no altering effect on the brain. Okay. Now, when you're referring to the independent variable versus the dependent variable, all you need to ask yourself, if you're given a question or scenario, is ask yourself what's being manipulated or changed. That's the independent variable. The dependent variable, all you have to ask yourself is what are you testing specifically? So in that example that I gave you, the independent variable would be the sleeping pill. That's what's being changed or manipulated. One group gets the IV, and one group does not. One group does not get the sugar pill or the sleeping pill. And then you've got the dependent variable. What are we testing? Well, we're testing cognitive performance. So in that example, the IV is the sleeping pill, and then the dependent variable is what I'm testing is cognitive performance. Okay, so another couple forms of study that we're going to overview is cross-sectional research versus longitudinal research. So whenever I'm referring to cross-sectional research, there are some advantages and disadvantages. Cross-sectional research takes a lot less time than longitudinal research. The reason being is because you're studying different individuals, in the particular areas that you're wanting to study. So it's less time-consuming, less expensive, and so let's say that I'm wanting to study the effects of smoking from the age of 18, and I check in And then what I'm going to do for cross-sectional is I'm going to look at a different group of 20-year-olds versus a different group of 50-year-olds versus a different group of 80-year-olds. And so the disadvantage of this is it's limited to one time of measurement and cannot examine change over time. Like with longitudinal research, if I were to conduct the same study, I have a group of 18-year-olds, and I check in with them at 20 years old, 50 years old, and 80 years old. That's a 60-year study. I wouldn't even be alive at that point to find the results. So that's the difficulty with longitudinal research, in that it just takes a long time to conduct. So you have this problem known as attrition. And attrition is the dropout rate over a period of time. Participants fail to complete all portions of the study. And then you have selective attrition. Certain groups of participants may tend to drop out. Okay? So the advantage of it, you can measure changes with age over time about these specific people. But the disadvantage is it's expensive, like I said, takes too long, and you've got that attrition. So that is where we're going to conclude with the first chapter of lifespan development psychology. I will see you in the next one. Have a great day.